There was a question in the back.
I appreciate the discussion on vacant lots, but I actually own my lot, and where my house is, I have about a quarter acre. And I may have missed this, but can you guys speak just a little bit about, do I need to get that zoned differently before I start? Because right now, I'm kind of doing this garden for myself, and it's morphing into something else. So what concern should I have about that before I dig up my garden?
So the question was, we've talked a lot about vacant lots, but if you own your own lot that you are growing on, in this case, a personal garden that's morphing into a little bit more, what sort of zoning or permits or considerations does one need to take? Great question, thank you.
Resources where I can go.
Yeah.
So right now, there is no zoning or permitting related to gardening or farming. Under the new zoning code, community gardening will be permitted everywhere except certain industrial areas. So you shouldn't have to worry about getting your lot rezoned.
But for an urban farm.
Yeah, or for farms. It'll be a conditional use in all those zones except for those few industrial zones. So I'm assuming that you're not living in an industrial site, so there's nothing you need to do to try to change your zoning to make it easier for you to do either a community garden or an urban farm. It will be equally easy everywhere.
But there would still be a permit.
Yeah, you would need to
That
get
would
it,
be the
yeah.
same.
There would be a permit process as I laid out in this thing. And that's if you're doing a community garden or an urban farm. If you're just growing food in your backyard for your own consumption, as long as you're not breaking any other laws, you should be fine. If you're doing that, if you're just growing for yourself, there aren't a ton of resources for you. There's a lot of information, but not a lot of resources. If you're trying to start a community garden, whether it's on your own property or on somebody else's property or whatever, then there are a lot of resources for you. Small grants through the Parks and People Foundation, support through the Community Greening Resource Network, etc. Does that answer?
You can join the Community Greening Resource Network as an individual.
But you don't get access to all the same resources.
You do now.
You do now?
Yeah,
Never mind.
so
So they just, Sea Green, which is short for Community Greening Resource Network, just changed their policy. So individuals, community gardens, schools, groups, it's all the same. You all get the same amount of stuff.
And let me also just respond to that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section in terms of sort of individual for-profit, which is something that we're seeing more and more in Baltimore City. So the Farm Alliance, which is really newly formed, is one resource that's out there. The Beginning Farmer Training Program, which Kathy mentioned at the beginning, which is run by Future Harvest, is another great resource. There's weekly workshops. These are sort of the specific urban component of that, but there are weekly workshops that cover a lot of topics, and that's a 8-part or 10-part series? 8-part series for $40 at the Ag Extension. And then there's also some other sort of workshop opportunities popping up. So we'll be sure to talk more about that in the next piece, but I think it's a really great question.
I would also suggest, and this really goes for everybody, that greening and gardening and farming in Baltimore City is not a new thing. It's been going on for a long time, and there's lots of really wonderful groups out there that have been doing this for a while, and they're all 100% receptive to talking to new people. So if you're starting a community garden or you're starting an urban farm on whatever kind of land, there's probably somebody out there that's done it once and would be happy to share information with you. And those are easy to find, but especially if you talk to us, 'cause we know what most of them are.
Does that answer your question?
Almost all of it, but I'll ask the rest of it later.
Cool, thanks.
I have a quick question. Is there any distinction between food production and flowers or herbs that aren't going to be for consumption but could be for sale?
So the question, no, that's cool. So the question was, is there any distinction between food production and production of cut flowers or herbs that might not be used for consumption? Great question.
Like, specifically to like the adopt-a-lot, if there's going to be, aside, I'm assuming, I guess, with the soil, but as far as zoning or anything different?
Yeah, the sole distinction in the permitting process is that you don't need to worry about testing the soil and presenting anything about safety if you're not growing food for consumption. As far as I know, there aren't any other differences.
You might still want to test the soil for your own personal
Yeah,
health.
Probably do.
So I didn't mention what was allowed on an adopt-a-lot. Abby mentioned you're not allowed to build a permanent structure. This is really, it pretty much is flexible. It basically just means don't pour concrete for the most part. Don't build a house. You can build a hoop house, a greenhouse, raised beds, a shed. But to answer your question more specifically, other than that, other than building a house, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So what we do suggest, however, is depending on what you're going to do, you're going to take a different approach. All of the vacant, or the majority of the vacant lots in Baltimore City used to have a house on it. And even besides that, the soil is not necessarily, grade A growing soil. So if you want to, grow edibles, you definitely want to get your soil tested. I brought some flyers for that over here. But if you aren't, if you're doing flowers or herbs, herbs you might want to do topsoil. Flowers, it's up to you whether you want them to be soaking up arsenic or not,
Yeah, we would want so. And then, second question, what about fencing?
Fencing is allowed.